Hello and welcome to the Girly Organist Podcast, where we consider all things connected to being a feminine creative artist, academic and musician. I'm Dr. Rebecca Potty, and in today's episode I will be looking at how to get a gig. So, how to get a gig. How do I get gigs? Concerts, recitals, they're all the same thing. It's generally, terminology is connected to a formality as opposed to paid work. That's what we're really talking about here. How do I get paid work playing my instrument as a musician? That's a really great question. So, I'm going to start off with some of my experience. Of course, this is the Girly Organist Podcast. Where else would we start? My gigging life as a musician has moved. It's changed over time, and that change has really been driven primarily by the instrument I have been trying to gig on. Now, my background is as a classical pianist turned organist. I didn't start out as an organist. From being young, that is a relatively new instrument to me. I started out as a pianist, piano player, and then became an organist. And you know what? It is different. So let's rewind a little bit. As a pianist, I'm going to say it. I'm going to use the word network. Oh! Awful word. Why is it an awful word? Because it's elevated to this status of everything is about networking and you're not going to get anywhere without your network, etc. And whilst in many ways that is true, what that network looks like for you as an artist, musician, can be very different. And I think the problem that we have in classical music is often this idea of an artist network is elevated to be at a completely unachievable level, and people think, oh my goodness, if I'm not playing in the biggest concert hall every single week, then my network, I don't have a network. And that's just simply not true. So, your network. Having been in music for 10 years, and so that's not including, time working really, but paid work, let's call it 10 years or thereabouts. One of the things that I have noticed is people are often trying to build their network in arguably the wrong places. Now, I know this idea of right and wrong is so reductive, but it is possible to build a network in a less than ideal area. So, for example, yes, it's important to build a network amongst peers. However, your peers are probably as skint as you, so it's likely they're not going to be that useful to you right now, but they may be in 15 years. Still waiting on some of that. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one giving them the work. Who knows? So building your network, yes, among peers is great. But I think there is so much focus, especially in music college and conservatoires and university courses, looking at employability and music around building this network of peers. And yes, it is 100% valuable in the long term, but in the immediate paying of your bills, probably not so much. For example, I was having a conversation with someone not that long ago, in the last few months, and they were saying, oh, well, I was advertising for some work and I want to, teach some music classes, and so I've advertised it to my friends. And I was like, okay, well, most of your friends probably can't afford it because you can't afford it and they're also trying to make a side hustle. So maybe that's not quite the network to be advertising it. However, the local community group that you're part of, maybe that's a good place to start. So I think how to get gigs, one of the first things to ask yourself, am I looking in the right place? Am I asking the right people? I see time and time again people going to networking events or gigs, and they're like, oh, I must get to talk to the artist, I must network with your artist. And for me, I'm like, it might be really cool and wonderful to meet the artist, but usually they're not the ones calling the shots. Have a look around the room, and perhaps the person that stood at the side of the stage or by the doors is actually the one that's calling the shots, getting the musician their gigs. So make sure you're networking in a productive way, because we can spend a lot of time and energy and effort networking in completely the wrong direction. There's another idea that floats around, and it's about the industry. And the industry is such a strange place, and that is because it doesn't really exist in the way that people seem to feel it does. I think people have an emotional reaction to this idea of the industry. I prefer to think of music as a sector of arts, and I think that's slightly different to thinking of it as an industry, maybe because it's slightly less personal, but also because within a sector there is so many subgroups, whereas within an industry it's like there's this idea that there's set paths, and if you're not on one of those set paths, then what do I do? I'm not contributing. Whereas if there's a sector, it's like, oh, well, there's, hundreds of things people could be doing within that field. And it's a broader way of thinking about it. So, my experience as a gigging pianist, talking about piano first, not the organ, we'll come back to that. Finding out who's who, and often putting in for the miserable jobs. And when I say the miserable jobs, I don't mean that the jobs themselves are miserable. I just mean that you might have this ideal of, I'm going to be X. And whilst that's great, in the meantime, you're going to have to work your way up to whatever the X is. And as with every other sector, it's normal to have to, jump around a bit and sort of ascend in various ways. So I would say getting with an agency. That's what I did. I worked for a music agency. I was with two for a period of 6 years. And that included corporate events, weddings, funerals, all sorts of, that sort of work. Corporate gigging musician, wedding musician, going to wedding fairs, playing things like that, accompanying singers at wedding fairs. That sort of work was all through an agency. And the one thing that I learnt about music agencies is they're not necessarily interested in how great a player you are or how great your profile looks. It's kind of important. It's important because it's representing yourself as any CV does, really. They're more interested in reliability. So it would end up where I would get picked for certain jobs in certain areas because they were like, we know that you will show up and deliver. And that's all that they want. I want them to pay me. They want me to show up and deliver. Quite happy, really. And this idea of showing up and delivering is something that is the difference between getting any gig and getting no gigs. And I think we don't talk about that enough, about that consistency in delivery and just showing up. And actually the showing up in itself is the bit that gets you the next job. I remember there was an opportunity came up through this agency that was down in South Manchester. Really nice, Didsbury, Wilmslow, that sort of area. And it was for a corporate charity event, so a third sector event, where, they were happy to pay, not mega bucks, but they were happy to pay for a musician. And they had initially another musician, and they were like, this person's going to be amazing, they're going to show up. But then this musician kind of was like, I never met them, but they sort of had a bit of a, oh, well, if I'm travelling up, then I'm going to need accommodation, and I'm going to need 3 days to prepare on site, and all of these like extra demands that they were trying to write into this contract. And in the end, the agency rang me up and were like, look, we have this client, it's literally tomorrow, this other musician is playing hardball. It was something like £300 to play for, 2.5 hours. Can you do it? You just turn up and play in the lobby for 3 hours. That's what the actual job was, to turn up and play some pop and, easy listening classical music for 3 hours in the lobby while there was a drinks reception going on. They were like, we're not going to pay £1,000 to a musician in accommodation and travel, as well as, 3 times the fee to play for 3 hours in a lobby for a one-off charity event. And so I was like, yeah, okay. I tell you, the amount of gigs I got out of having done that one is unbelievable. Like, it kept me going for a year, just having done that one gig and saying, yeah, okay, I can do this and I'll be reasonable. It got me so many more gigs. And I think there is this crazy idea at the moment online, and I say it's crazy idea, this is my own view of it, where there's a huge, a conversation about doing things for exposure. We'll talk about that another time. But this idea of make sure you value yourself. And whilst I am on board with value yourself appropriately, and appropriately to the context with which you're being paid to do. So, if you're doing a wedding, there is a kind of band of like pricing for that sort of thing. If you're working for an agency, there's bands of pricing. You can find out how much, cut they're taking, etc. And I'm not saying undercut. I'm not saying be the highest. I'm just saying make sure you're pricing fairly, because it's not necessarily what you're worth, it's what you're worth doing that job. And sometimes people will price themselves super high because they're like, I'm amazing and I'm this fantastic musician. And you probably are, that's probably true, but the actual job you're being asked to do is not worth, in time, cost, industry, sector, pay scales, what you may want to charge in an ideal scenario, just because the budget isn't there, because customers will only pay so much for certain products. So I would just say, have that in mind. Let's switch ahead to me becoming an organist. Wow, is that different? So when I stepped into the organ world, it was like stepping back in time 30 years. It is very much, I don't want to say who knows who, because it's not necessarily who knows who. It is who wants to know who, more than who actually knows who, or who wants to be seen as connected to X, Y, and Z. And this is something that in corporate wedding land, gigging musicians, real life, just does not really translate into being an organist at all. And I suppose I went about getting early gigs in the organ world in the same way that I would have got them in the piano world. And whilst that worked in some ways, in other ways, it was not what was required. And I think in the organ world, church music world more broadly, what's really interesting is you're basically doing it for free. So you have gatekeepers to certain instruments or location, and it's very much prestige driven, opposed to because there is no money. So I think there's a few things that have changed. Today I'm sat here giving a podcast, and I'm not a gigging musician anymore. That's not to say I don't do gigs, concerts, recitals, etc. It's just that's not how I earn my living solely as a gigging musician, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, every week. And there are lots of musicians that is their life and that is what they do all the time. That's not what I do anymore all the time as my sort of actual day job. So I think when I am looking for gigs now, I do view it differently, but I view it differently because it's not, my bills aren't necessarily dependent on whether I'm doing that gig, etc., or could get something else. So I think being aware of this as an idea and what different parts of the sector look like for different instruments. I don't know very much about orchestral instruments, for example. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know. I've never worked in an orchestra professionally. So you would have to speak to an orchestral musician about that. But gigging in church music and organ world is very different to being in the sort of corporate music sector. And ultimately, the next gig comes out of the others. I'd just say that with church music, I would always work from the basis that you won't get any money for it, whereas a corporate gig, you would always get paid for it. So I think that when people, especially on here, that are organists, ask me, can I do, how do you get gigs? How do you get concerts, etc.? I would just say, keep in mind that doing the concerts is a useful thing to do. It's great for meeting audiences, great for practicing, performing, sharing new music, all these things. I love doing organ concerts, but you will have a difficult time being a gigging musician if you are looking that way for payment, because the most you're probably going to get is either your fuel covered. You might get £40-50 to cover your petrol or train ticket, or you might get a £10 lunch voucher or something. So just be aware that that is the that's what you're going to get out of it in monetary terms, which surprises quite a lot of young musicians, especially in church music, especially if they've transitioned from being a pianist, more corporate music gigging to, because actually you would earn more real money if you were working as, if you did a Saturday night at the pub as a function band or something like that. So I think just be aware of the how to get gigs is not necessarily how to get them is not hard. Just ask. Even in the organ world, just write people, just ask them. If usually you have to be a year ahead with organ things, and asking now for next season. And I think have a look at the sorts of frequency of organ recitals. If you are going to ask a series that has them every week, you're more likely to get a spot than if they maybe have 4 or 5, one a month for a particular set period. So just be aware of things like that and what you're asking for. But just ask. And I would say for me, working for an agency was a really positive experience. I know there's some horror stories people have had from agencies, but I can honestly say that I've had more any negative experiences I've had, it's been doing things as a freelancer as opposed to freelancing through an agency. And I think that's important to keep in mind when deciding how much hassle you want. Because for me, I was like, I'm quite happy for someone to take the cut. If I'm just, get a list of this is what you need to play, this is what you need to wear, show up, play, go home, get paid. Whereas other people like to be far more involved and, negotiate the process, etc. And I think that's good, but it depends on how much time you want to invest in that sort of thing. I think online platforms like Encore Musicians, etc., can be really useful. Social media can be really useful, but not necessarily, because, let's face it, an events team that's organising a wedding or a wedding planner, etc., they're generally not looking specifically through musicians' profile online. They're just going to go straight to an agency or to people that they've worked with before. And ask them direct. I think if you're doing something really special, so like I have a really good friend, Glenda Alloway, who's a harpist in London, and she, her work is niche because it's harp, so people will look a bit further for something like harp than they would for, a string quartet or a singer or an organist or a pianist, because we're a dime a dozen by comparison. And so, she does some excellent reels. Actually, you can go and check her out if you haven't already, about how to get gigs and like costing of gigs, etc., which is really interesting, useful information to know. So, how do I get a gig? Go and ask. Seize the day.